Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamerTech.com video, we're going to be further discussing the PlayStation 4's GPU versus the Xbox One's GPU. This is part 4 of the videos. In part 1, just to get us all on the same page and all, we spoke about why it doesn't really work if you do a direct comparison to PC graphics systems, as well as memory bandwidth and ROPS. In part 2, we spoke about APIs and low-level access that the PlayStation 4 is going to enjoy, which of course the Xbox One doesn't, as well as the DX11 architecture as well. In part 3, we spoke heavily about the compute functionality of the PS4, as well as the Sony-specific changes to the GPU and APU as a whole, which of course they've made in conjunction with AMD, such as the various buses and all that good stuff. So if you've not checked those out, feel free to do so, and then you can come back. For everyone else, hopefully you've now caught up, and now we can jump right in. So surely it's, we've basically finished now, right? Unfortunately for me, and I say that because this is a hell of a lot of recording, this is actually the biggest RGT project that I've ever done. In terms of the amount of work, in terms of research. Each video is taking me about 3 hours, actually, research plus. But there's still a heck of a lot more to speak about, including things such as move engines, including shader units and operations, overall tying everything together, and I think a couple of other bits and pieces that I've got in my notes that I've got to speak about as well. So I'm going to start this off with the move engines. Now, you're not going to find any information on the PlayStation and Move engines unless you call, PlayStation Move, but that's completely different. Move engines are exclusive to the Xbox One, and Microsoft have added them in directly into the die of the AMD Jaguar for a sole purpose, and that's to move data around. That's pretty much what it says on the tin, in actuality. And they can do this in numerous ways. For example, they can move the data from RAM to ESRAM, or they could do the reverse. They can move the data from ESRAM to main RAM. They can move the data to or from a linear or tiled memory format, and a heck of a lot more besides. Now, I have really extensively covered all of the bits and pieces of move engines before in a different video. However, in this video we're going to be doing things a little bit differently, and we're going to be speaking about how it's going to tie in to the overall performance of the Xbox One, as well as the implications to the GPU. So you guys could check that other video out if you so wish, or you can watch it a later date, or not bother. I will speak about some of the basics in this video. Now, the move engines can actually move the data at 256 bits per GPU clock. And as I said, they do this per GPU clock cycle. This gives you about 26 gigabytes per second of transfer both ways. And there are 4 of these move engines, and they all share a single memory path. Now, the move engines share this bandwidth with the other components that are on the GPU as well. And so, for example, video encoding and decoding, display output, and a heck of a lot more besides. Okay, so what is the actual purpose? Well, one of the primary reasons that Microsoft went with this is to actually alleviate worry and bottleneck from the GPU itself. The purpose is in theory, it helps to move the data around rather smoothly. Now, it's also worth noting that the move engines themselves can actually achieve exactly the same thing as what a shader could. Now, shader reading and writing could actually do this a little bit faster. For example, you've got almost double actually the performance if you're writing to and from copying, actually, from ESRAM to ESRAM. You're looking at about 26 gigabytes per second if you're doing it through the move engines, and about 50 odd, just under about 52 gigabytes per second if you're doing it from the shaders. And the same thing could be said for anything else. Each time it's a bit faster if you're doing it directly from the shaders rather than using the move engines. And so there comes this question, why would you use the move engines? Well, 2 of them has actually been dedicated specifically to ZIP and LZ, which are memory compression formats to stream data. Now, all of this basically is to alleviate the worry and the bottleneck of actually doing this from the shaders. So, for example, let's assume the GPU is being compute bound. Let's say it's doing everything it can. It's working in this magical world of 100% theoretical usage, and it can't do anything more at all. While that's happening, the actual move engines are still free to move their stuff. They can still do this without impeding the rest of the performance of the console. And so they can do this in parallel, in other words, at the same time. Now, one example of this is, let's say the GPU was accessing, say, the ESRAM, just for example. Well, let's assume that the CPU, for example, needed, or let's say the GPU even, needed data from, say, the RAM. So not the ESRAM, the RAM. Well, they could do that, and it would not impact the shader functions whatsoever. Now, what we do know is that compute can already do this. Sony have been using this for various tasks indeed, and Mark Cerny himself, and of course he is the lead architect behind the PlayStation 4, I'm sure everyone knows that by now, but just wanted to point it out. And he's actually said that, look, it doesn't matter how much the GPU right then and there is rendering in terms of game time, 100% of it is not being used. And so he figures, look, it's better to utilize it for things such as compute. In other words, at some point or another during the frame, as we discussed in the last video, in the compute video, there are certain points in the frames, such as shadows and various other bits and bobs, that some of the shaders are just chilling. They're not doing anything. And they shouldn't be chilling and doing nothing, because you've only got finite resources. So isn't it better, it's more sensible, to instead use those resources on, well, compute? So that's basically Sony's answer. They're using compute to move around the data, the shaders to move around the data, whereas on the Xbox One, instead, they're going more the move engine route. Another purpose is, and I'm kind of surmising here, just theory on my part, but I would imagine another primary reason that Sony went for this is the ESRAM as well. They knew that they needed a way to make sure that the data flowed around really simply on the system. This is completely contrary to that of the PlayStation 4. Now, the PlayStation 4, as we know, has a couple of buses. It has the onion and it has the garlic, and we know that the GPU and CPU can speak to the memory however it wants, but it's still a hell of a lot simpler. So the Xbox's move engines are there for fast direct memory access. Direct memory access, by the way, the abbreviation DMA, just so you're aware of what that means in the future if I ever use it. And because these accelerators are fixed function, in other words, the Xbox can't really speak to them, because all of the algorithms are basically embedded directly into the hardware itself, it's most likely, therefore, that as a games developer, you're not really going to notice even that they are there. This is done so that as a games developer, especially if you're working on cross-platform titles, you don't have to think to yourself, oh crap, now I need to worry about coding for these things, and you're not familiar with them. And that's quite a big deal, because you don't want to have to worry about doing something that you're not familiar with in a cross-platform development environment, and leaving those developers to use it, because it often doesn't go well. This is one of the issues that Sony had with the SPUs on the Cell. It took a long time for those developers, for third-party developers, to really start pushing that hardware, to really start to utilize the cells, because they were really used to the way the Xbox 360 was doing it, and they preferred that method overall. So it's most likely that the move engines themselves will somewhat alleviate some of the work from the CPU and GPU. Just how much and how successful it is, it's unknown. I think this is going to be one of those things where we're going to have to hear from games developers later on, especially when they've got more experience on both systems. And secondly, on that little point, there's still a hell of a lot of NDAs, and I'm sure that when the NDAs get lifted, developers are going to be a lot more honest in like 2 years' time. Yeah, this sucks. You know, we're just honest that this sucks, or this is really great. We don't know which way it's going to go yet. I wouldn't be surprised, however, if, because of the complexity of the Xbox One's memory system, remember the reason they went with DDR3 is they basically bet on the wrong horse, Microsoft, and they wouldn't really want to admit that, but it's kind of obvious because Sony could have gone the same route. They could have used the GDDR5 memory, combined even with ESRAM, but then they chose not to at the last minute. And the story behind all of this, of course, as we know, is that Microsoft wanted 8 gigs of RAM initially, and Sony didn't. They originally were shooting for like 4 for the PS4. And then, of course, they kept on hearing from developers that they really needed 8. And that's how they managed to cram it in. But that's a slightly different story. So, there are still things to discuss, of course. One of the big ones is how are multi-platform games going to handle on the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. I.e., let's say that you were to go out and buy a game, let's say one of the initial titles like Call of Duty. What's going to happen with that game on launch titles? Is it going to run the same? Is the frame rate going to be the same? Sorry guys if you can hear a little bit of noise, it's absolutely hammering down in the UK. We've had a heat wave and that can only end with rain in the UK. Regardless, let's assume that you have a title like, say, Call of Duty Ghosts, and it's released on the PS4 and the Xbox One. What happens in terms of the frame rate and the resolution? Remember, both consoles are going to be aiming for 1080p for the foreseeable future. So what happens there? Are we going to be seeing lower frame rates or, variable frame rates, and they'll just be lower on average on the Xbox One? And then there's another argument, well, okay, the launch titles are fine. What about 3 years down the line, when we see less cross-platform games with like the Xbox 360 and the PS3, and the games have been developed specifically for the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, PC, and maybe a new Nintendo console if they've released one by then, who knows? And what happens in those cases? How does the Xbox One compete? Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with basically internal resolution and output resolution. Internal resolution is the resolution that the game is actually rendered at. In other words, what the graphics card is actually rendering the actual scenery at. And on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 era, I know we're going back a little bit, but it's for a purpose. Generally speaking, the PS3 did worse. There were numerous tests around the internet and articles about it, so I'm not going to bother to, mention specific websites or anything like that. You guys can Google them. But it's well known that the PS3 versions of the game either had lower resolution, they would have lower or worse anti-aliasing, and we've spoken about what that is, or their frame rate would be worse. And there are numerous examples of this. Call of Duty, for example, Sleeping Dogs, and many more besides. And it was a simple case of the resolution internally was lower than what it should have been, and then they simply upscaled it. However, before anyone gets too really excited and says, aha, Xbox One on that round, not really. Some titles on the Xbox 360 were also sub 720p, and you would get titles like Halo 3, for example, which was 1152 by 640 with no anti-aliasing, or Halo Anniversary, which was 1152 by 720 with FXAA, or no AA on the classic. And this would continue with various other titles as well. And the purpose of this, of course, is rather simple. As you've probably guessed, it's simply that the GPU itself is not capable of rendering in the native resolution. Now, when Microsoft originally announced the Xbox 360, and I did watch the initial conference with Jay Allard, and the guy was really good. He was really charismatic, very much like Mark Cerny in that respect. And to be honest, and this is a slight aside from the whole GPU thing, just for a moment, a momentary tangent, if you will, that I personally think that the fact that they've not had someone like like Mark Cerny or Jay Allard to be on front and stage center with the Xbox has really hurt them, Microsoft, in terms of their relationship to the gamer, because Jay Allard, I didn't agree with everything he did with the Xbox 360. Remember, he left, after a while anyway, Microsoft, but you could tell the man had passion, he knew what he wanted to do, and this is the same with Mark Cerny. I think that kind of been a bit of a detriment to Microsoft as well, but that's just my personal opinion, of course. Anyway, so when they first announced it, they wanted 720p to be the standard, and that was like the Intel standard, and then of course they released an update which allowed the Xbox 360 to run at 1080p. And all it was basically doing was internally on the graphics system upscaling. It had a built-in upscaler, and it would use that to upscale the game and make it look a bit prettier. Now, some games had dynamic resolution, or in different modes their anti-aliasing or resolution was different. For example, Forza 4, it would be 1280 by 720, so true 720p, but it would be 4 times anti-aliasing if you're in, say, time trial mode. However, if it was like in a proper race with multiple cars, it would be 2 times. Now, the reason behind that is simple. It's doing more stuff. And so obviously if you're just, viewing a car or whatever in that mode, then it's 4 times, because it's cool, it's not really doing anything strenuous. On the other hand, if it's doing a lot more, then you can imagine it would have to drop down the resolution, or drop down either resolution or anti-aliasing to make it smoother. And indeed, even on the PS3, you had titles like Gran Turismo, and remember it had something known as 1080p mode, and how everyone was really excited about that, and they were questioning how it was going to work. Well, people have done some testing on that, and they've come up with the conclusion it was actually 1280 by 1080p. So 1280, of course, is normally the width that you would give 720p. So it's 1280 by 1080, and that was 2 times anti-aliasing. However, if you're running the game in the garage and showroom and that type of thing, then it was actually true 1080p. It was 1920 by 1080 with no anti-aliasing whatsoever. But if you're running the console natively at 720, then it would be 1280 by 720 with 4 times anti-aliasing. And the same thing for various other titles as well. So why the heck have I just gone through a list of stuff that's for the past generation? Well, it gives you an indication of just what happens when resolution needs to be sacrificed. Now, the purpose of sacrificing resolution is simple. You have too many things that needs to be rendered on screen. It's pretty much that simple. It's not exactly, rocket science, but there you have it. And the fact of the matter is, developers who don't really want to be named, it seems, and various sources in the industry are already going to assume this is going to be the case for the Xbox One. It's not really a massive assumption, however. It's kind of like saying, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, guess the next number that I was thinking of. And sure, there is a possibility that I could have been thinking of 5,122, but most likely, of course, it would be the logical progression of the sequence. You're actually talking about quite a lower amount of GPU compute power. Now, right now, we've talked about a lot of stuff. We've spoken about the move engines, which of course could affect overall performance of the GPU. We've spoken about memory bandwidth. We've spoken about compute as a whole. We've spoken about the difference in specifications somewhat. We're going to still go into that a little bit more, however. And we've also spoken about a few other bits and bobs as well. But despite the fact that the Xbox has had a moderate increase in clock speed, it's not like it was like, I don't know, to 982 megahertz or something. It was from 800 to 853, which is still good. I'm not going to discount that. That's still a good increase no matter what. It's possibility that we're going to be seeing in not too long, maybe a couple of years' time, that titles are going to have worse anti-aliasing. Which, of course, as we've spoken about before, is the process of eliminating jaggers and so on in games. there are multiple forms of anti-aliasing, everything from FXAA to MSAA and various others. Probably going to do another video to actually explain all of that. I am partially tempted for this video, but this series is probably already going to have another part as is, because this video is already becoming really lengthy and I still need to speak about a hell of a lot of stuff. So it's possible that what we're going to start seeing is that PlayStation 4 titles in the medium term will still be at 1080p, whereas the Xbox One versions will maybe be a slightly sub-resolution, maybe 17 something, or maybe 16 something by something. It's hard to know. For example, it could be 1600 by 900. That would be one example, which is sub 1080p. Another possibility is that we're going to be seeing the Xbox versions of the games running at, say, 30 frames per second, and the PlayStation 4 versions running at 60. Now, John Carmack himself has said that both systems are very similar to one another. It's actually quite remarkable of how close they are architecturally and in terms of performance, but he did give a caveat that he hasn't heavily benchmarked both machines. Plus, it's very hard to say how much he was actually just trying to be nice to both companies and keep both companies sweet. Now remember, compute is going to be used for quite a lot of stuff. It could be used for collision detecting, raycasting for audio, and a lot more besides. So I have a feeling that developers, not now, certainly not for a while, because we're still at this point where it's not really practical, because they still have to worry about the lowest common denominator. My favourite saying is the convoy sails as slow as the slowest ship, or as fast as the slowest ship. And in this case, it's going to be the Xbox 360 and PS3. They're going to be like the ginger stepchildren, if you will, of this generation. They're going to be like the ones that no one wants to really be catering for in terms of the graphics artists and the engine development, because they're going to want the games to be really shiny and look awesome, but they still have to cater for the larger install base. So it's good. I mean, for example, it would be very interesting to see the sales of Call of Duty Ghosts on all of the machines and just which ones it sells most on. I think that'd be pretty interesting indeed. But for now, I think that there's a good possibility in the short term that we're not really going to see any issues at all. I think that all games are going to be 1080p. If they're not, then that doesn't really bode well. However, at the same time, if they're not 1080p natively and they're not running at 60 frames per second or whatever, let's say for example the PS4 version runs at 60 and the Xbox version runs at 30, just throwing it out there, it's not necessarily the end of the world, because you've got to bear in mind that the developers are still getting used to the hardware. It's not like they magically know how to use it. However, in a couple of years' time, it's going to be very, very curious on what the developers are going to be doing with the relevant piece of hardware and how far they're going to be able to push them. Obviously, despite the fact that everyone, is really excited about the PS4 and the hardware and everything else, that too will have issues in a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years down the line, running games at 1080p natively. That's just a given. Because it's like the circle of a console's life. At the start, you've got all this power, and it doesn't really take a genius to know that you're going to make better games. Various developers, including John Carmack, has said that, look, one of the benefits of all this extra GPU power, of this memory, is you don't have to mise. It's not like this thing where you have to, cut your own arm off to be able to show, just the bloody stump. You actually can be able to show the whole arm. My point is, you still have to be rather careful. You can't just waste, cycles on bugs and poor memory management and a hell of a lot of other stuff. But you can be in the mindset that you're able to produce a lot better effects. However, John Carmack himself has said that, look, one of the issues he doesn't want to see on the next generation is excuses of, well, I want to see, really pretty effects and not 60 frames per second gameplay. And he believes, look, 60 frames per second and 1080p is really what we should be shooting for here. There's no point in having these huge ass, screens with like 1080p, but then the game keeps dipping. And do you remember a couple of videos back how I was speaking about God of War and its variable frame rate? This is for God of War Ascension, of course, on the PS3. One of the reasons behind that, as I've mentioned already, is so that you can actually put different levels of detail in a game, and it's basically a clever use of the game's engine. It gives you all the shines you need when you need them, but when the action becomes thick and you're not really going to be looking at the lighting of a scene so much, and you just need to pound some dude's face, or several dudes' faces at once, then it can put it in a more relaxed room, less lighting, less high resolution textures, or whatever they've got to do on that particular section. More close-up camera angle, or change the camera angle so it's not rendering so much. Lower resolution shadows, whatever they need to do in that section to make the frame rate higher. Because once again, no one wants skipped frames, because that's just crap for gameplay, and no developer really wants that, because I think most people, including me, I would much rather play my games at know that internally the resolution is like 1600 by 900 and then it's upscaling, big whoop, than what I would the game keep dropping frames, especially if you're playing like a fighting game or playing like an FPS or a game where you actually need to react on instant. That's just awful. You guys know what I mean. Like, if you've ever played on a PC or whatever, and just at the moment you're going to snipe someone, your antivirus starts whirring. This is a really big problem back in the day. It's not really an issue now, but back in the day, oh my god, Norton. That's why I was so glad when Norton was like no longer a thing. You're playing like a game, and just when your antivirus has started, and you just hear the hard drive whir, and you're just like, okay, I'm dead. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really big thing. I don't know how long it's going to take for the resolution, but as I said, developers are already starting to say that this is going to happen. And it doesn't really take a genius. Like, an unscientific method would be to get two graphics cards of the PC and then get them roughly the same percentage of power difference, and then you could do a benchmark, right? You could do that. And it would be one way to go. It's not necessarily, I'm not saying, however, it's going to be a direct correlation. It's not necessarily a correlation between, like, as I've said before, it's not necessarily going to be like, okay, well, you've got 50% less, GCN cores, therefore you are going to have 50% less performance or 50% less frame rate at the same resolution. And why is that? Well, you can see Mark Cerny's own notes, because there are times when, well, the game engine's not really doing anything, or the CPU's maxed out and so it can't process any more data, or you run into memory bandwidth issues. Even the PlayStation 4, it has a lot of memory, yes, but it's not this magical fountain that keeps giving every time you go back to it. There is a finite amount of resources on any console, and if you do stupid stuff with the memory, and you don't use small bits, for example, that's one of the things that even the Gorilla have said, and you just randomly start pillaging the memory, you're going to run out of it. So there's that, there's CPU, there's going to be, engine limitations at the start, especially with cross-platform games. There's going to be a hell of a lot of stuff that's going to be coming into the fray here. And so I don't necessarily know how long the disparity between Xbox One titles and PlayStation 4 titles is going to take. I can tell you one thing, however, from absolute damn certainty. I'm going to be there, and I'm going to be doing some analysis on this stuff. I'm going to be doing visual analysis, frame rate analysis, and crap tons more stuff. I can assure you of that much, guys. So this video has already turned pretty damn long. I was kind of hoping to be able to finish this video, if I'm honest. Oh god, it takes so long to record these. Yeah. So I've almost finished, however. I think next part should be the last one, if there's any mercy in the world. Next part, I need to speak about shaders. We're going to be tying everything up and just going over overall specifications and just my final thoughts and conclusions, and just tying all the stuff up together, basically. So we've spoken about frame rate, we've spoken about the move engines, we've spoken about the various performance differences. We've given examples of previous consoles and goodness knows what else. So this has been one of those videos that's going to be setting up primarily for the next one. So yeah, just as an FYI, completely off topic from what I've been discussing, this is actually one of the reasons that I've been wanting to split some of these tech videos up, because I found that a lot of the time I was going to like the 40-50 minute mark, and technically, yeah, I can upload videos much longer than that, you know, in this magical world, but I was actually getting messages from people who didn't really understand certain points, or worse, they felt that I missed something out, and I really don't like that feeling. There's no way in hell I'm going to be able to cover every single topic, even with this video series. I probably missed something really obvious, and like 2 months later I'm going to have someone say, by the way, but I don't like that feeling of not covering everything, because for me, it makes me feel that I've not done a good job, and I don't like that. Also, I think for the viewers, it's doing a disservice to you guys, because I don't like not doing a good enough job and not giving you guys enough information. And also, it allows me to much better go into tangents that actually explain something, such as what anti-aliasing is or what move engines are, rather than saying to you guys, oh, just check out this other video, or, you know, you can Google that, which is crap and it's not really professional. So I'd much rather make the videos longer, make them, you know, I mean, I don't even know how long this video is, because I've actually had to record this in a couple of parts. You guys won't notice that. It'll be one whole contiguous video for you, but for me it's like 2 or 3 parts now, and I haven't taken note of the length of them. But it's probably like 30 minutes plus already. So total, I think this whole series is probably going to be like 3 hours watched. And it's probably about, if I had to make an assumption, about 12 to maybe 16 hours of research. I honestly haven't kept track anymore. I did the first like 2 or 3 videos, but I haven't since then. So it's probably about 12 to 16 hours of total research and stuff over the last couple of days. So I've had a very interesting weekend. Anyway, hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video. I know it's been a bit of a tangent video on this one, but I really need to set it up for the next video so that we can close this off and we're all on the same page and I can give my final thoughts. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. I can only hope I'll see you soon. Take care, my friends, and have a good day.